And so for this announcement of, cutting development funds is such a betrayal for people fighting for democracy.
Hello and welcome to episode 46 of What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. It's Friday, September 26. Today, we have two special guests on the show. Dustin Barter, Senior Research Fellow in the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI Global, and Stella Naw, an academic activist working on Indigenous and decolonial peacebuilding and governance practices. They have co-authored a new report with a third author, Naw, calling for a rethinking of humanitarianism amid Myanmar's contested governance. But before introducing them and having that conversation, I will quickly cover three major developments in the news over the last week. First, resistance forces, including the Kachin Independence Army, have had their first major victory for some time, this week managing to take control of most of Banmauk town, which is a timber and mining hub near the Kachin State Sagaing region border in Gata district. The KIA and People's Defence Forces launched an assault on September 15, enduring at least 10 airstrikes as well as drone and artillery attacks. But by September 20, they had seized the central wards of the town from the military and soldiers from the Myanmar military-aligned Shan Nationalities Army, the SNA. The Myanmar military has been coordinating with the SNA in Banmauk since losing control of Indore, which is about 35 kilometres southeast of Banmauk, in April. The routed SNA and Myanmar military forces retreated from central Banmauk to the town's outskirts and wooded areas, along with some of the civilian population of the town, which is 70% ethnic Shan. The military launched 3 airstrikes on the town soon after losing it, and resistance forces expect that fighting could rear up at any time, as the SNA troops remain nearby. Before the offensive, the military had considered Banmauk sufficiently stable to hold polls there for its planned so-called elections at the end of this year. Taking and holding Banmauk allows the resistance to further block attempts by the military to reinforce its offensives in the north and re-establish its logistics routes into Kachin State. And second, while the KIA would be pleased with the Banmauk victory, it continues to fight the military with less success on several other fronts and is still bogged down in Banmauk, unable to dislodge the military from that vitally strategic town, the second largest in Kachin State. And this week, news of a deadly airstrike against the KIA came to light. Last Wednesday, a regime airstrike on a KIA training camp in Shuigu Township killed at least 17 trainees and injured 19 more. The KIA claims the training ground's location was leaked to the military, which hit it with a precision strike. But the source of the leak, whether human or digital, is still unknown. The site of the camp, which was operated by Battalion 12 of the KIA's Brigade 11, had only recently been cleared for use. The KIA, of course, has taken control of dozens of military camps and towns, mostly in Kachin State, over the last 2 years, and is under intense pressure from China, along with the National Liberation Army, to sign a ceasefire with the military. By the way, for a detailed take on China's recent role tilting the scales in favour of the Myanmar military, you can read this week's Political Insider newsletter, which was sent to all Frontier members on Sunday. And third, the Swedish government announced actually 2 weeks ago that it will end all development aid to Myanmar by mid-2026, justifying its decision by citing the need to reallocate aid to Ukraine, as well as citing the supposed worsening conditions for development work in Myanmar. Sweden will still provide humanitarian aid, however. Organisation Human Rights Myanmar said that Sweden has provided $176 million in development aid to Myanmar since the 2021 coup, and, I quote, The withdrawal of this support threatens to dismantle critical infrastructure for independent reporting and human rights monitoring. The withdrawal of USAID had already created a precarious funding landscape. Sweden, as one of the last major donors with a strategic focus on human rights and media freedom, was a final pillar of support for these embattled sectors in Myanmar. This news, of course, comes during a year of immense need in Myanmar. Let's not forget the devastating earthquake from March this year, the near-daily airstrikes on civilians, the regular atrocities such as arson of entire communities carried out by the military, the economic devastation and increased poverty since the 2021 coup, the more than 1 million refugees disenfranchised and made stateless, the tens of thousands of people held in camps in Rakhine State against their will. Just to stop there, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs claims that in Myanmar currently 20 million people are, quote, in need. Now, this is the context for a new report by ODI Global, Making Myanmar, Humanitarianism Amid Revolutionary State Building. Now, based on dozens of interviews and in-depth research, this report argues for a rethink. We're lucky to have two of that report's authors with us here, Stella Naw and Dustin Barter. They both not only have deep working expertise in Myanmar from before the 2021 coup, but also share broad understandings of the aid industry and humanitarian action and challenges globally. It's a pleasure to have both of them on the show so soon after releasing this report. Hello, Stella.
Thank you for having me.
And hello, Dustin.
Thank you so much for having us.
Sticking with you, Dustin, to start us off, could you give us a brief introduction to ODI Global?
ODI Global is a global affairs think tank based in London, also with offices in Brussels and Washington. I'm in the Humanitarian Policy Group team, but we also work on politics and governance, climate, finance, and many different issues. We try to focus across many different regions where we've had a long-term engagement in Myanmar through myself and other researchers, along with broader ASEAN engagement. Myself have been engaged with Myanmar for 10 plus years, which kind of originated and contributed to a lot of the research that we'll be talking about today. And we're trying to connect that also with our work in Indonesia and Philippines around ASEAN, state-led, state building, state-led crisis response.
Thank you, Dustin. Now, Stella, Sweden announced its development aid withdrawal actually right before your report was released. So I wanted to ask, what is your reaction to it as an author of this report, but also as an activist?
The announcement from the Swedish government was just heartbreaking and so disappointing for several reasons, because Sweden has been a friend of these Indigenous ethnic struggle, like political actions for freedom and equality for a long time, not only for the gender equality, but also, right, these political actions, for seeking justice, and also the work for democracy and inclusion. And so there were explanations for, the need to concentrate its focus on Ukraine so that it can secure its EU zone. But the problem is that that's not a complete assessment or smart strategy in securing, EU in its fight against, the threat from Russia. We all know that it's very real, right? Russia's threat to its EU member countries. But the problem is the Myanmar army has been such an increasingly important member to this global authoritarian gang led by Russia and China. And so Myanmar army has been a source of income for Russia, and also, even more importantly, its strategic spread of authoritarianism. And so for this announcement of, cutting development funds is such a betrayal for people fighting for democracy, because Western allies and Western nations, how they talk about the importance and value of democracy, which is, what the resistance is about. And so for people, this announcement is not only loss of material support that's so needed every day for development funding, because humanitarian funding may be about food and health, But development funding is about justice and democracy and inclusion and about women's rights and also emotional support. That is why we were so disappointed that, they make that decision, but it's not too late yet, right? They can go back to rethinking a more proactive, security strategy for EU and democracy around the world. And yeah, so I have worked closely with Swedish Burma Committee for the last 10 years, very closely on many issues about, that I just mentioned about, peace building and justice and security, human rights documentation. And Sweden has been a friend for a very long time in many areas where even when other donors were reluctant to support, justice and human rights documentation. And so it's not too late yet. We can, reverse the decision for a more inclusive, holistic, and proactive, security strategy that centers democracy and inclusion, and that's not reactive to just what's happening right now. So yeah, I'm gonna end there.
Thank you, Stella. In there, you've made this distinction, and we've made this distinction already between development aid and humanitarian aid. And of course, Myanmar has seen more humanitarian aid than usual this year with the Sagaing earthquake. Many countries donated earthquake relief through the Myanmar military regime. So, Dustin, Sweden is continuing its humanitarian aid, not through the military. Is this helpful? Can you talk more about this distinction?
Thanks for the question, Luke. Jumping off what Stella was saying, I think it is very short-sighted that Sweden and CEDA are finishing development aid, because you have the three pillars. You have humanitarian assistance, which is very much around short-term, meeting immediate life-saving needs, essentially. Then you have development, which is a very broad catch-all term for working on governance, politics, human rights, democracy, a whole range of issues and kind of longer-term solutions. And then you have the peace-building aspect, which is, from locally led peace-building efforts at a very granular grassroots level up to national level peace processes. And by only focusing, and this is happening across Myanmar, but across much of the world as well, by just focusing on humanitarian and prioritizing that above all else, you're actually failing to address a lot of the root causes and drivers of conflict, drivers of injustice, and the reason we have a lot of humanitarian needs. So CEDA and Sweden are not alone in kind of going, oh, okay, there's far less money to go around, let's just throw it at humanitarian needs. But it really fails to address these drivers and root causes of different crises, whether that's Myanmar or elsewhere. So as we talk about in the report, really across Myanmar, you need to bring these sectors together, and the divisions between humanitarian, peace and development are quite arbitrary and imposed top-down from donors, whereas a lot of Myanmar national, local actors are dealing with everything. They're doing a little bit of peace building, conflict resolution, they're meeting long-term needs, but also providing life-saving assistance. So this arbitrary division just doesn't work for them. And what you need is a much more holistic approach. So what CEDA has done, and this is actually quite problematic, and it goes actually the opposite of what we're calling for in the report.
Can I add? It's ironic that people working in the community on locally or nationally, for them, these two, right, humanitarian support and development programs are hand in hand. You can't compartmentalize them. And my problem, and many activists and civil society who are working with communities that are calling for justice, is that humanitarianism is very state-centric, right? That's the biggest problem with international humanitarian system, where Myanmar military, who is a war criminal, is considered a legitimate partner versus people taking care of themselves or taking care of each other on the ground, be it local civil society, national civil society organizations, or resistant organizations are considered non-state, less than equal. And so do we want to work with whoever is in the state that are committing war crime? Is that the whole point about humanitarianism? And so the reason why it's also unfortunate and disturbing and wrong about the development funding cut is that humanitarian funding, most of them primarily goes through the central government. Right now, the junta, who is the cause of thousands of deaths. And so we talked about in the report that revisiting the historical parts on peace building and, even before that, before 1947, right? These ethnic indigenous peoples who were self-governing people before, they had their own state, they had their own territories where they governed. But then with the British colonial process, we lost our territories. And then in the modern day, where we're again under this colonial, authoritarianism, or under the military, right, authoritarianism. And so from people with states to now without states, not by choice, but by force, are again oppressed within this state-centric humanitarianism. There is no hope, for people who are from the oppressed and marginalized community. And so for me, that's why it's very, there is a need for critical reflection and transformation for, humanitarian approaches in the way it works with, partner, who they consider their partners. And that's the whole point about our report, right? And yeah, so I'm going to stop there for now.
Yeah, that's a great place to stop. It brings us nicely to the meat of your new report. And in that report, you argue, of course, against providing humanitarian aid through the military regime in Myanmar. But you do something interesting. You go further. You posit that resistance groups opposing the military are, in fact, creating a new, legitimate, pluralistic state in the wake of the 2021 coup. You say this new state is what international humanitarian organizations, actors, should engage with in order to support the needs of Myanmar people. So for you, the Myanmar state is not fragmenting or failing. In fact, it's currently being generated. So please, Dustin, tell us more about this pluralistic state.
No, thanks, Luke, for the question. So with the report, we're really trying to dive into these deep questions around who constitutes a state building processes, and trying to get beyond this idea of a very centralized state narrative and singular state. Hence, we use the term a pluralistic state. Now, if we look at contexts like Myanmar, but also others, Yemen, Somalia, Syria, they're often framed and portrayed as fragmented or failed states. And what we are trying to demonstrate through the report is what you have is a pluralistic state-building process that is not about a central state actor absorbing power and controlling subnational entities, but instead you have a lot of different mechanisms of state-building going on concurrently and interconnected. So in the case of Myanmar, you have actors like the National Unity Government trying to connect at a very national level. You have a lot of the ethnic resistance organizations that are often decades old, building up different states at different levels. But then you also have these like quite granular grassroots actors, whether that's a People's Defense Force, the PDFs, or other community-based organizations building, state entities at very different levels. So what we're trying to do in the report is go, okay, you have this international aid system and aid architecture. Humanitarian actors often push this idea around neutrality and independence, and therefore we can't engage with the state. But what we're saying is actually amongst this state-building process, you really need to move beyond this idea of just independence and neutrality to actually engage with what is going on in the country. And so rather than treating the central junta military who is committing war crimes across the entire country, international humanitarian actors in particular need to start engaging with and understanding this broader state-building process that's going on. And by doing that, it can lead to and contribute towards that state-building process. So, for example, at a lot of the subnational levels, you have, Karenni, Kachin, various other state-like entities providing humanitarian assistance at varying degrees. You have local and national civil society actors providing humanitarian assistance, also health, education services. And rather than just going, oh, that's too difficult, we need to maintain our separation as a aid architecture, is saying, no, actually, engage with these different actors, understand the governance, and work with them to support them to deliver these various services and humanitarian assistance. We use and I quote from the report, international actors need to understand this reality rather than espouse neutrality that is creating a veil of ignorance. And that veil of ignorance is just used to operate this entirely compartmentalized aid operation and humanitarian architecture in Myanmar that's, largely headquartered in Yangon. It's very restricted in where it can go, very restricted in who engages with. As Stella has already highlighted, there's all this effort to try and get access and permissions from the military junta. Yet what we should be doing is going, actually, there is this pluralistic state being constructed, and let's see how we can engage with that in a constructive way and play a contributing role rather than a competitive or entirely parallel role.
Thanks, Dustin. That's a really interesting concept to think with. But first, I just want to take a moment out from the interview to ask the listeners, are you Frontier Myanmar members? If not, you really should be. We have 2 great new features up on the Frontier website this week. The first is on social media and the court of public opinion in Myanmar, and the second is on the perils of abortion for Myanmar women. Of course, we have great new content every week up online, and for Frontier Myanmar members, we have Political Insider, newsletters, daily briefing, newsletters, and media monitoring as well. So please jump online, frontiermyanmar.net/memberships, and check it out. And now, Stella, we have this new way of thinking about the state, just, spoken by Dustin, but I wonder about more concretely, are there already humanitarian actors, as you call them, already engaging with this pluralistic state, maybe engaging in ways that others could learn from if they choose to do so as well?
I'm so glad that we're getting to talk about that, because the best practices and inclusive, creative practices are happening on the ground with humanitarian assistance delivery. Because when international donor organization, right, humanitarian aid actors are obsessed with trying to get access through Yangon, through Naypyidaw, they're being held up and they complain. But there are locally led Indigenous ethnic civil society organizations that have been working, and they just through cross-border or through the partners across the border, sitting inside their community with them, taking care of the needs, humanitarian needs, while providing, supports to these peace building and state building process for reasons that they have trust from the community. It's very clear to them that the point of the accountability for these local civil society organization who may, local doesn't always mean like just in the local context physically, right? They work directly from cross-border or with organization, their partners, national or international partners from across the border. So, but these organizations, local civil society organizations, understand the importance of accountability, and they were very clear with every discussion, every interview I had with them for our report that they were accountable to their community because their community trusts them, and that comes with responsibility. And so for them, the vision is, what do the community, the communities they serve need? And how are they going to get those resources? Those are the 2 most important points for them, meaning they have to be practical, they have to be flexible, they have to be, be there. Unlike international humanitarian system, the UN and INGOs, international organization, who are just waiting to get permit, waiting to be allowed to have access. And so the UN and international organization and funding organization have to look at these local practices happening about, why it's working. Or international humanitarian actors and the UN, are they willing to evolve? Are they willing to adapt to the needs of the local situation if they want to help solve the problems, and if they want to help the people? They cannot just hide behind this impartiality and neutrality, which just lacks any kind of empathy and understanding of the people's suffering and their vision for justice and equality. And so, there are local civil society doing great work, and what they need is, the resources that our international partners cannot keep cutting. And just to end this point, though, there are some international organizations that are taking very low key, keeping low profile, but then doing this support, giving support to this their local partners, and more organizations should step up and do that, including and especially the UN, because what UN stand for is sometimes it may be statement, but that's the first step, and they have to do more and recognize these local partners and other resistant actors as the legitimate partners to not only make it work on the ground in the context of Burma, but to transform their system that is dying and becoming so irrelevant around the world.
Okay, thank you, Stella. And that makes me think more there about the why of the state-centric approach a little bit more. And I think maybe thinking explicitly about some of the other recommendations that are stated in the report. It says that international actors, humanitarian actors, need to overcome their persistent risk aversion that leads them to, in Myanmar, favor engaging with the military over options that you've just been talking about, Stella. So, Dustin, maybe I could ask you about these risks. What risks are they avoiding, and how can they instead accept them, or as Stella put it, evolve even?
Thanks, Luke. So operating in any volatile conflict situation, as Myanmar is extremely volatile, airstrikes, sporadic armed conflict, there are so many risks all the time to everybody trying to deliver humanitarian assistance. Unfortunately, the primary risks that get focused on by aid donors is the financial risk of, do we have a receipt for this purchase? Do we have a receipt for giving cash to these 10 families who have been displaced? And this whole discussion around risk is very much centered around financial risk for donors. What is overlooked is all the frontline humanitarian responders, which is entirely local and national organizations who can reach into the most difficult areas. International humanitarians are stuck in Yangon, maybe stuck in Naypyidaw, maybe in Mandalay, and can't actually access any of the high-risk areas. And so the security risks, and you have a lot of aid workers and community-based workers being killed across Myanmar, and this is occurring across the world in Gaza, Sudan, many other contexts as well. Yet the aid architecture is very focused on financial risk, rather than thinking of the security risk for all the people trying to deliver assistance in the most hard-to-reach places. So there's an irony within that itself. Then we talk about some organizations like Sweden and CEDA. They actually have a priority within their humanitarian strategy to reach the most hard-to-reach areas and provide assistance to the most difficult and inaccessible areas, which is a very excellent kind of value by Sweden to operate in a country like Myanmar. So it means getting into a lot of the border areas, the resistance-controlled areas, and things like that. So in the report, we're saying international actors and funders need to really overcome this risk aversion and this focus on receipts. There's a lot of community inbuilt trust to ensure there is not aid misuse. Funding is getting through to the people who need it. And this perpetual focus on the financial risks is actually very detrimental. And it leads to huge amounts of money being channeled through UN agencies, through international non-government organizations, whereas that then filters down eventually to local actors, but you lose a lot of money through that kind of flow down along the way. So when we are calling for overcoming the risk aversion, it's really overcoming the financial risk aversion, but also being able to address this intense security risks for a lot of local and national actors. And that means, providing sufficient financial resources for addressing security concerns, ensuring people are supported so they're not having to take unnecessary risks, whether that's being able to travel through safer transport routes or whatnot. But then we had one example in the research where people were literally hiding receipts, having to smuggle receipts back to Yangon because the donor or UN agency wanted hard copy receipts and wouldn't accept photos of receipts. And so everybody who's involved in that process, whoever's smuggling the receipts, whoever's transporting those hard copy receipts, is put at risk simply because of some compliance measure. And to me, that's just frankly unacceptable. I understand donors are concerned about taxpayers and this idea of there's corruption or there's aid misuse. But that's kind of a very simplistic narrative, whereas maybe donors need to spend more effort to kind of communicate with their public and say, okay, we are working in volatile settings where there are some risks, but we will address these in certain ways. And we are doing our best efforts to minimize the security and personal risks for individuals delivering humanitarian assistance. If we think of the bigger picture, and this is where we talk about the pluralistic state, donors and the international political community are so adverse to engaging with, the NUG, with the KIO, the Karenni, all these different resistance actors. And this is what the report is calling for. You need to have engagement with them as peers, as legitimate governance state actors. Instead, all these donors, international political actors are saying, no, we'll only engage with the military junta, which is not a legitimate state actor, but they feel, no, it's too risky to engage with these other resistance actors. So really, the overcoming risk aversion is not just on the humanitarian delivery front, but also on this governance front. And interestingly, you see some really excellent examples of that engagement happening, but it happens very discreetly, and then nobody really talks about it. And then other donors okay, if it's all happening discreetly, we can just put it to the side and not actually replicate those kind of practices. We have these kind of dynamics going on, yet we continue kind of pushing down this perpetually UN INGO centered route. The earthquake was a particularly poignant example, and I get a lot of civil society actors really lamenting to me now that the UN put up all these nice photos, and you look at their websites of we're responding to the earthquake, we're delivering, different kinds of assistance. Yet they were so heavily restricted, and the military manipulated the aid flows for the earthquake so heavily that it didn't reach a lot of areas in need. And it also, if you have 100 million, 200 million of aid for the country for the year, this is just indicative figures, then it all gets channeled and redirected towards the earthquake response that the junta is able to manipulate. Meanwhile, everybody, the 15 million plus in need of humanitarian assistance because of the ongoing conflict and revolution, all of a sudden have all that potential aid sucked away to meet the earthquake response that is manipulated. So we really need to have these kind of honest conversations, double down on taking risks, engaging with this pluralistic state, because that is, it's the current, but it's also the future, and addressing the drivers of the actual crisis across Myanmar.
Thank you, Dustin. Now, your recommendations are not only in that direction, you also have some for the pluralistic state as a whole. You urge the pluralistic state in Myanmar to improve its accountability and transparency. You recognize that doing so is critical to it being perceived as legitimate. But this is a bit tricky because, of course, the revolution that is building this pluralistic state is quite diffuse. Many different groups in many different parts of the country, different political goals in political dialogue with one another, with other nation states, with the Myanmar military. I mean, how can there be accountability and transparency in this kind of radical, political, generative environment?
I can respond to that briefly with beginning with accountability, right? So earlier I mentioned, right, civil society actors were very clear to us that their point of accountability lies with the community they serve. And so it is also the case for revolutionary and resistant organization, especially those have been around, since the 50s and 60s. They are drawing a lot of traditional practices, including accountability and, collective governing of their own communities with the modern practices, right? These, federal democratic practices. So this hybrid form of governance, where one example I could share, in Kachin community for hundreds of years, we practice a movement called Kum Lao movement. People rebel against their leader, chief, if the chief refused to listen to the people, particularly if the chief refused to engage in fair distribution of land every year where people work on to feed themselves or their family. And so Kum Lao movement as one example, right, where democratic practices where the chief, if they don't listen to the people, will be ousted from their position. And so these existing, indigenous resistant organizations are, practicing that hybrid form of governance. Is it perfect? No, but we're figuring out, these different resistant organizations, be it NUG or these, indigenous organizations, figuring out and building and honing these governance practices to imagine what is it going to be like in a pluralistic state where it's so diverse, right? Ethnically, religiously, culturally. It just needs some time to figure it out. And the best thing about it is that any international partnership and investment in this resistant movement and state building, there is a guaranteed outcome compared to partnership with the military. Again, the war criminal, who spent close to $1 billion since 2021, since the coup to buy fighter jets from Russia and China, where nearly half of the country's 55 million people are starving.
Thank you, Stella. We should always keep that in mind. Dustin, do you have anything to add here on your recommendations that the pluralistic state improve its accountability and transparency?
I think there's always a constant process of improving transparency and accountability, which is also for the pluralistic state, whether that's PDFs being accountable for, how they act at a very localized level, or if we're talking about the more established ethnic resistance organizations. I think the KO example of rare earth mining, of suspending licenses, is a really good example of its community legitimacy hangs on the ability to be accountable to the population, and is another excellent kind of example, as Stella's highlighted. What we're calling for in the report is, as part of it's such an uphill battle with the international aid and political architecture that you really need to demonstrate your transparency and accountability for this international legitimacy. And the pluralistic state has far more legitimacy than the junta, which is proven time and again for decades to commit war crimes, be immensely corrupt, abuse the population. But still, the accountability and transparency components are really critical for the pluralistic state. That's why we put that recommendation in there. I think also for international donors and the political community this goes back to the discussion around CEDA and Swedish funding, is not just focusing on humanitarian assistance, but also recognizing the importance of civic space, independent media, actors like Frontier, producing excellent analysis, but also, DVB, Myanmar now. Like Myanmar within the region has some of the best independent dynamic media that is really a critical part of this accountability and transparency for the pluralistic state and also for the military. So it's really going, okay, because there is a humanitarian crisis, don't just focus on this so-called life-saving assistance, but also continue to support civic space, support civic activity, support human rights activists, because this needs to happen to improve the legitimacy and the accountability and the transparency of this pluralistic state. This came through in other research that we are doing concurrently in Indonesia and Philippines, where the state there is, very effectively delivering crisis response. Yet civic space is still such a critical component and really needs to be supported. Preserving civic space and having that civic accountability to hold the state to account is fundamental. So we can't lose sight of that. Obviously, there's lots of proactive steps NUG, EROs and others can do to kind of boost their transparency, boost their accountability. And, we hope also there can be a virtuous cycle when we think of, health, education, humanitarian response by the pluralistic state that also strengthens the connections with communities. Communities are more vested in this pluralistic state building process, and it kind of creates a very virtuous and positive cycle that is critical to, the ultimate game of ousting the military.
Okay, well, you've given us a lot there in this report. I really recommend that everybody go and check it out. Of course, you can just read the executive summary if you are short on time. The full name of the report, once more, is Making Myanmar Humanitarianism Amid Revolutionary State Building, and it's linked in the show notes. It's given us, lots to think about here, and also interesting to touch on legitimacy, which has been spoken about by our guests many times in the past few weeks in regards to the elections, the military's planned elections for the end of the year, and seeing this other angle and consequence of international legitimacy, literally who gets life-saving support, who gets food in their bellies, and all the other kinds of assistance that you've talked about here. Now, let me say thank you so much, Dustin Barter and Stella Naw, for coming on the program.
Thank you so much.
We had a slight recording issue. Rest assured that Dustin did say goodbye. And now, goodbye from me. To all our listeners, thank you for tuning in again for another week of what's happening in Myanmar. We appreciate your support. You can email the show, whimyanmar@proton.me. Everyone at Frontier loves to hear from you. And very quickly, before signing off, I just want to draw your attention to a Frontier live event coming to you next Wednesday, October 1st at 7 p.m. Thailand time. The panel will be about enduring struggles across borders, the precarious lives of Myanmar migrants in Thailand, with 3 excellent speakers and a moderator. If you're not a Frontier Myanmar member, there's no better time to sign up. And hot off the press, as I finish producing this podcast episode and send it out to all of your devices, we have a new opinion piece on the Frontier website. It's about seeking solidarity for Myanmar in a cruel world, and how the pro-democracy movement in Myanmar needs to innovate and forge international alliances with like-minded movements, if it's ever to defeat the military regime. And with that said, another week goes by. Take care and farewell.